There's a neighborhood in New Westminster, British Columbia that I think is a bit strange. It's called the Brewery District. You can't miss it. Its name is proudly printed on signs, flags, and spelled out in big block letters. But there's a key thing missing in New Westminster's Brewery District. The breweries. There's not a single one. There's an insurance broker, a freshie, a poke bar, but the only thing brewing here is coffee. Well, I think there's something else brewing here too. Trouble. Such a bad line. The Brewery District was once home to an actual brewery, the Labatt Brewery, makers of Budweiser, Bud Light, and other respectable beverages. But in 2004, the building was closed, and then later redeveloped into this brewery-free brewery district. Now the problem isn't that this neighborhood is essentially a lie, or that my Budweiser now comes from the other side of the province. No, the problem lies with what this neighborhood replaced: industrial land. That is land reserved by local governments for large and loud businesses, like factories, warehouses, and breweries. These are businesses that people typically want far away from their homes, so it makes sense to have areas set aside for them. But recently, more and more cities have been redeveloping industrial lands. Safeway's warehouse in Burnaby, now about to become 20 apartment buildings with shops and restaurants. This warehouse in Halifax, bulldozed to make way for an apartment complex with shops and restaurants. And Mr. Christie's Cookie Factory in Toronto, once known for Oreos and Chips Ahoy, it'll soon be known for 15 apartment towers with a mix of condos, offices, a new park, and of course, shops and restaurants. This is such a common occurrence that many have described it as a crisis. Okay, hold on. A crisis? Really? There are many crises out there. The housing one, the climate one, and my existential one. But since when did we care so much about warehouses? What's so wrong about turning industrial lands into this? Shops and housing? It's a fair point. We actually have a long history of building over industrial lands in North America. Case in point, False Creek in Vancouver. It was once an industrial district at the heart of the city, with sawmills, warehouses, and train tracks. But in the 70s, False Creek began to transform into a residential neighborhood. Today, those lands hold some of the hottest waterfront real estate in the city. Instead of sawmills and warehouses, there are glass condos with dog parks and a seawall. Of course, people love it. But this isn't just about looks, it's also about money. Building housing and shops on industrial land is incredibly profitable for developers and generates tons of new taxes for local governments.
Get on my level, get on my level. I'm too fly, up too high, get on my level.
It's good old-fashioned capitalism mixed with new urbanism. We get rid of smokestacks, build trendy new neighborhoods, and make way more money. But repeat that over and over again over several decades, and you end up with a bit of a problem. In many cities today, there is barely any industrial land left at all. For example, this is all the industrial land in Metro Vancouver, and this is what is left over for any new industries. Tiny little pockets and slivers here and there. But at the same time, industrial land is kind of a hot commodity right now. First off, there are a ton of new businesses looking for industrial spaces. For example, you have food processing companies like vegan cheese producers and chocolatiers. Then there are biotech labs, welding shops, film studios, even artisan jewelry makers, and that's just to name a few. But some of the largest demand right now is coming from the shipping and logistics industry. The rise of e-commerce and global trade has created a huge demand for spaces that manage the flow of goods. More port terminals to unload containers off ships, and way more warehouses to store and sort those goods. And recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has put that demand into overdrive. Lockdown measures around the planet have caused huge disruptions to global trade. So now, companies are looking to stockpile their goods so they don't have to rely so much on these supply chains. That will require way more warehousing space, which will require way more industrial land. But finally, caught in the middle of all that are industries that are actually quite essential to the functioning of a city. For example, when you take out your recycling, it goes to a recycling depot on industrial land. When you flush your stuff, it goes to a sewage treatment plant on industrial land. And if you got milk, you can thank the dairy processing plant, which you can find on... You getting the idea? All of that is vying for the little industrial land we have left, and it's getting cramped. With a few exceptions, most major industrial centers across Canada are near vacancy rates of 1%. Basically, any industrial space that can be rented out is already full, and that has resulted in skyrocketing rents. This is how much industrial rents have increased in just the last 3 years. In cities like Toronto, it's up by more than 60%. So what does that all actually mean? What does having an industrial land shortage look like on the ground? Well, it's difficult to say for certain, but we've begun to notice some patterns. First off, industrial businesses either leave a city or avoid setting up there in the first place. This is really apparent in a place like Vancouver. Its ports manage almost half the shipping containers coming in and out of the country, but many of the warehouses that process those goods are actually located in Calgary, like the main warehouses for Walmart, Home Depot, Canadian Tire, and Rona. So if you buy something from any of these stores in Vancouver, your item was most likely shipped in through the Port of Vancouver, brought to a warehouse in Calgary, then trucked back to Vancouver. And the reason why is quite simple. Calgary has the industrial land available and Metro Vancouver does not. But those are businesses that are able to relocate elsewhere. For businesses that serve the local population, it's more likely that they just shut down. A common example is car repair shops. People still very much use their services, but many increasingly find themselves unable to keep up with the skyrocketing rents of industrial areas. The last pattern I want to mention isn't so much about businesses, but about the people working in them. It's worth noting that industrial lands tend to offer opportunities for those outside the service and knowledge economy, and these are typically well-paying jobs. In fact, studies have found that industrial lands hold a much higher concentration of middle-income jobs compared to a city's average. So with that, many are concerned that redeveloping those industrial lands is contributing towards the growing income inequality within our cities. In the last several decades, major cities across Canada have all reported more people living in poverty, more wealthy people, and a shrinking middle class. Now, in some ways, this is a bit of a dilemma because, let's face it, many cities today are also in a housing crisis. They do need to build new housing somewhere, right? So I think you could see this as a tough but necessary pill to swallow. Maybe we do need to develop over some of our industrial lands. But I'm not so convinced by that. It's important to remember that cities have tons and tons of land set aside for just houses. They're called single-family neighborhoods, and they are abundant in pretty much every city in North America. For example, in Metro Vancouver, this is all the land we've set aside for this kind of neighborhood. If we're talking about where we could add more housing, it's precisely these areas that I think we should be looking at first. But efforts to add more housing into single-family neighborhoods are almost always met with an outcry of resistance. Homeowners protest that new apartments will change the character of their neighborhoods, among other concerns. But if someone proposes building an apartment on industrial land, it's much less likely that there'll be public backlash. I think that makes you see the industrial land crisis a bit differently. We're losing industrial land not because we have to, but because it's the politically convenient thing to do. And for me, that points to a larger issue. Cities have limited amounts of land and many legitimate uses that compete for it, like housing, shops, and industry. And as cities grow, we have to carefully consider what we prioritize and why. But I think our priorities are often skewed by a very idealized aesthetic of what we like about our cities. You tend to see it on tourist blogs, social media, and real estate ads. That aesthetic rarely includes industrial lands. And I get it. It's hard to get excited about a warehouse or a sewage treatment plant. In fact, I would wager that most of us are very comfortable with those things being out of sight and out of mind. But while industrial lands might not always be the most trendy, Instagrammable thing, it will always play a critical role in supporting our cities. And I think reminding ourselves of that fact is the first step towards solving any industrial land crisis.